Welcome to the debate. Imagine an employee, trips over an exposed wire in an office hallway.
Right. The liability there is obvious.
Exactly. It's completely obvious. A photograph is taken, an incident report is filed, the wire is taped down, and, well, the case is closed.
Yeah, it's a solved problem.
But now imagine an employee whose manager is quietly, systematically changing their performance targets, say every 3 weeks, until the psychological pressure causes them to just completely break. Where is the photograph for that?
Oh, it simply doesn't exist.
No, in the UK, it just doesn't exist.
And it doesn't exist because we are operating in this massive statutory vacuum. I mean, in the UK, there is actually no legal definition of workplace bullying, which, sounds absurd when you say it out loud.
It sounds totally absurd to anyone outside of HR or employment law. Absolutely.
Right. We have ACAS, the Advisory, Conciliation, and Arbitration Service. For our global listeners, they're essentially the national labor conciliation body here. They provide guidance on what bullying looks like, but it is just that. It's guidance.
It's not enforceable law.
Exactly.
It's totally toothless in a strict legal sense.
And if you try to pull a different lever, say the Equality Act, you just hit a brick wall, unless the bullying is specifically attached to a protected category,
Right, like race, gender, or disability.
Right. So if your manager belittles you in every single team meeting, but you don't fit into one of those protected categories, the Equality Act essentially shrugs. And the Protection from Harassment Act, that demands a quote-unquote course of conduct that is practically impossible to prove in a corporate setting.
Leaving constructive dismissal.
Yes, which is essentially a legal fiction where we tell the victim, just quit your job, lose your livelihood, and then maybe you can bring a claim to a tribunal.
Exactly. Because the law fails to define the harm, workplace investigations suffer a total evidentiary collapse. And, well, this brings us to the core tension we are exploring today.
The central question.
Yes. With this glaring legal vacuum, should organizations compensate by stripping away managerial discretion? Should we rely entirely on rigid, audit-ready governance architectures, specifically tools like the National Workplace Adjustment Framework, or NWAF, and, digital passports to protect workers?
And that's your position, right?
It is. I will be arguing that strict, reconstructable governance is the absolute only way to eliminate undocumented shadow practices and, frankly, survive the severe regulatory enforcement shift coming in 2026.
And I will argue that replacing human discretion entirely with immutable automation treats employees like, data points in an evidentiary engine. I advocate for a proactive psychosocial hazard framework, like the models we are seeing in Australia. Building a rigid fortress of purely defensive evidentiary compliance, it just creates a dehumanizing compliance theater.
Let's break down why this strict governance is no longer optional. Parliament has never legislated a standalone bullying law. Because of that, HR departments have inherited a massive systemic failure.
Oh, absolutely.
They are constantly blamed for toxic cultures, but are given zero legal infrastructure to actually manage them.
I am with you on the inherited failure. HR is completely stranded here.
Right, so what happens? You get shadow practices on the operational floor. A manager makes a quiet, undocumented workaround for an employee, and then it vanishes the second a new manager arrives.
The new manager reversal.
Exactly. With the Fair Work Agency, or FWA, launching in 2026, and the new mandate demanding employers take all reasonable steps to prevent harm, we can't rely on whether a manager is having a good day or a bad day. The solution has to be structural. We need the NWAF.
Let's actually explain that for a second. The National Workplace Adjustment Framework, and specifically these digital passports, because they are central to your argument.
Yes. Let's clarify that. A digital passport isn't a physical booklet. It is an immutable digital ledger attached to an employee's profile.
Okay.
It explicitly logs and mandates their specific working conditions, sensory needs, or communication preferences. If you have a neurodivergent profile, the passport clearly states, needs written instructions, not verbal.
Right.
And crucially, it cannot be altered just because a new manager doesn't believe in the employee's needs. In this model, concrete evidence replaces subjective testimony.
But you are over-automating a profound human issue. When you define compliance purely through reconstructability, meaning your ability to perfectly reconstruct a timeline of events for an external auditor, you reduce human suffering to a procedural checklist.
It's not a checklist, it's protection.
Let's be honest about the motivation here, though. Organizations aren't doing this to care for people. They are doing it to avoid the upcoming 25% penalty uplifts at employment tribunals. Look at Victoria's 5-standard model in Australia. They redefine bullying as a psychosocial hazard.
Which means what, practically, when it comes to enforcement?
It means they place a positive duty on the employer. Instead of waiting for an employee to break and then, checking if the digital passport was filled out correctly, the law forces the organization to proactively audit the environment itself.
But
wait, just to finish the thought, they look at how workloads are distributed, what are the management practices. That is actual prevention. What you were describing is just highly organized reaction.
But let's look at what happens on a Tuesday morning when a new manager takes over a team. That is where this legal vacuum actually hurts people. The high-level frameworks are fine to debate, but down on the operational floor, we have that new manager reversal we mentioned.
A classic driver of operational drift, yes.
It is the primary cause of automated harm. An employee is struggling, maybe with interpersonal friction, maybe with a hidden disability. They go to a sympathetic manager.
Right.
That manager uses their discretion to make informal adjustments. They say, take Friday afternoons to do deep work, skip the weekly stand-up. It's all off the books.
Because it is a human conversation, they are solving a problem organically.
But it's a shadow practice. 6 months later, a new manager arrives. They look at the official KPIs, they demand strict adherence to standard hours, and they pull the rug out.
Yeah, that does happen.
The employee fails. Performance management begins, and the employee claims they are being bullied. But when the organization investigates, there is an evidentiary deadlock. There is absolutely no record of the adjustment. Think of discretionary, undocumented adjustments like building a house on a handshake.
The handshake house.
Exactly. When the building inspector arrives, or, in this case, when leadership changes, the foundation simply disappears. Discretion in this context isn't flexibility. It is just a synonym for inconsistency.
You are treating discretion like it is inherently unsafe. Yes, new manager reversals cause catastrophic damage. But eliminating managerial discretion entirely to prevent that creates a completely different set of rigid deadlocks.
How so?
If the rule is written down, the rule is followed. Let's look at an edge case. What happens when your digital passport system misinterprets overlapping human conditions? Say an employee has a complex, fluctuating situation. Maybe they are dealing with long COVID combined with situational anxiety stemming from a specific team dynamic.
The passport would document the necessary adjustments for both conditions.
But a digital passport demands static parameters in a dynamic human situation. What if the parameters change on a Thursday?
Well,
The employee's fatigue is worse, or a major project deadline shifts unexpectedly. If the manager has absolutely zero discretion to adapt in the moment without running it through a rigid, audit-ready NWAF pathway, the employee suffers while waiting for the bureaucracy to catch up. Discretion and governed pathways have to coexist. Removing the human element is a massive overcorrection.
you're assuming bureaucracy is slower than human failure. The data doesn't support that. Empathy is a wonderful trait, but empathy is not a scalable governance strategy.
It's not about scale, it's about
It has to be about scale. Relying on empathy means an employee's psychological safety depends on who their manager happens to be on any given Tuesday.
I'm not saying we rely solely on vibes and good intentions, but we have to talk about the psychological impact of the systems you're proposing.
We do. We need to talk about the clinical outcomes of these shadow practices. Bullying is not just behavioral, it is a governance harm. When you have unclear systems, vague feedback, and those meaningless zero-tolerance posters on the wall, you trigger severe clinical responses.
Right.
You trigger cognitive load, hypervigilance, and rejection-sensitive dysphoria, or RSD.
Let's ground those terms for a second so we don't lose the lived experience here. For anyone listening who has ever received a vague, "we need to talk about your performance" email, from their boss on a Friday afternoon and then spent the entire weekend absolutely panicking. That is cognitive load and hypervigilance in action.
That's a perfect example. And if an employee has ADHD, for instance, that ambiguity alone can trigger a profound RSD response. The uncertainty is what actually damages the brain.
I agree that uncertainty is damaging.
Procedural fairness, absolute clarity, and a lack of ambiguity protect mental health. We can't rely on warm feelings. We have to build a system that guarantees fairness, even if it feels robotic. Governance is the cure.
You're entirely right about the clinical harm of ambiguity. It's well documented that inconsistent enforcement skyrockets cognitive load. But you're treating automated governance as a cure when it might actually be a poison.
A poison? Providing clear, immutable guidelines is a poison?
When it strips away all human nuance, yes. Let's really examine what it feels like to be on the receiving end of this perfectly reconstructable system.
Okay.
If every single interaction, every minor adjustment, every moment of friction is logged, formalized, and processed for the sake of an audit trail, the workplace starts to feel like a surveillance state under the guise of protection.
It is an evidentiary trail, not surveillance. It protects the worker.
To the employee, the distinction is often meaningless. If an employee just needs human dialogue, but they are met with a digital passport interface and a manager who says, "I can't help you unless we log this in the NWAF ledger," they feel profoundly alienated.
But that alienation is subjective.
Are we losing the lived experience inside this strictly procedural framework? If an employee feels commodified by the very system designed to protect them, then your governance architecture itself becomes a psychosocial hazard.
But how do you validate a lived experience in an employment tribunal when it is fundamentally he said, she said?
You are viewing this entirely through the lens of a courtroom.
Because that is where these disputes end up. Without reconstructability, the lived experience is just a story the law ignores. Think of reconstructable architecture like an airplane's black box. It doesn't fly the plane, but when something goes wrong, it tells the investigators exactly whose fault it was based on hard data, not subjective memory.
That analogy is actually doing my work for me.
How so?
The black box doesn't stop the plane from crashing. It just protects the airline from liability if the pilot was at fault.
It forces the airline to train better pilots because they know they are being recorded. Which brings us squarely to the 2026 enforcement shift. We really have to look at how these internal systems will survive contact with the incoming external regulatory reality.
The Fair Work Agency's arrival?
Yes. The Worker Protection Act changed the phrasing of employer duties to demand all reasonable steps. The Fair Work Agency is arriving with proactive state-led audits. They are heavily expanding whistleblowing protections, and crucially, we are seeing the removal of the support stage.
Explain the mechanism there for the audience. How does a proactive audit actually work in this context?
It means the FWA doesn't wait for a tribunal claim. They can walk in and demand to see your governance architecture. And let's talk about public sector accountability here.
Oh, that's a huge piece of this.
Right. Public sector bodies, the NHS, local councils, they are funded by the taxpayer. The FWA is going to look at them and demand absolute evidentiary perfection. If an employer cannot perfectly reconstruct their decision-making timeline during one of these audits, they face severe penalties.
So it's all about liability.
We're talking a 25% uplift in compensation payouts and public naming and shaming. Vicarious liability is going to crush organizations that don't have this locked down.
But do you hear what you're saying? You are proving my point. The motivation behind this shift isn't actually about protecting workers.
It absolutely protects workers by forcing compliance.
No, it forces organizations to engage in highly sophisticated compliance theater to survive the audit. The UK is building a system where employers are perfectly safe from vicarious liability as long as their paperwork is flawless.
If the paperwork dictates safe pathways, the workplace is safer.
Not necessarily. You can have a perfectly reconstructable timeline of interventions, a pristine digital passport ledger, and still have an entirely toxic, high-attrition workplace. Contrast the UK's obsession with evidentiary defense against Sweden or France.
They operate under entirely different legal frameworks.
Because they regulate the harm itself. They have anti-bullying statutes that criminalize psychological violence. The UK, by failing to define bullying, is just regulating the paperwork surrounding the harm. Reconstructability just means you are very good at proving you followed a process. It does not mean the process actually helped the human being.
But process is the only mechanism we have to enforce fairness at scale. HR departments must demand evidentiary infrastructure like the NWAF because they are operating in the dark. Without a statutory definition explicitly stating what psychological violence is, HR is trying to referee a game with no rulebook.
So we write a better rule book. We don't just log the fouls more accurately.
Until Parliament writes that rulebook, we have to log the fouls. If an employee is suffering from systemic marginalization that doesn't neatly fit the Equality Act's protected characteristics, a digital passport guarantees their adjustments are honored.
I see that, but
It removes the selective enforcement that plagues corporate environments. Evidence matters more than culture, because culture is invisible in a courtroom.
because culture is invisible in a courtroom, we abandon it for audit trails? That is the tragedy of the UK legal landscape. HR is indeed dealing with an inherited failure, but doubling down on an evidentiary fortress doesn't solve the root problem. Let's go back to Australia and how they actually enforce their positive duty.
I know you favor the Australian model, but how does it functionally differ when an inspector actually knocks on the door?
In Australia, a regulator doesn't just ask to see the paper trail of how you handled a complaint. They assess the organizational design itself. They look at role clarity. They look at job demands.
Okay.
If a specific department has a massive spike in workload and a corresponding spike in sick leave, the regulator identifies that as a psychosocial hazard before a formal bullying complaint is even filed.
So it is an environmental assessment.
Exactly. They hold the employer liable for the environment. If you design a job where a person has the workload of 3 people and a manager with no training, that environment is the hazard.
Right.
The UK approach waits for the harm to occur, forces the employee to navigate this rigid digital architecture, and then relies on the reconstructability of the response to dodge a penalty. One is a framework of prevention, the other is a framework of highly organized reaction.
I don't disagree that environmental assessment is incredibly valuable. But until the UK Parliament actually legislates a positive duty or a standalone bullying law, organizations operating here do not have the luxury of philosophical prevention. They have to deal with the statutory vacuum today. And the only way to fill an evidentiary vacuum is with evidence.
But evidence of what? Evidence of compliance or evidence of care? That is the friction here.
Let's summarize our positions as we draw to a close. I maintain that until Parliament legislates a standalone bullying law, organizations have absolutely no choice but to rely on strict, reconstructable architectures like the NWAF and digital passports.
Right.
Relying on managerial discretion is a massive liability. Discretion creates shadow practices, and shadow practices cause evidentiary collapse. To survive the 2026 Fair Work Agency audits and protect employees from the clinical harm of ambiguity, we must engineer out subjective inconsistency.
And my summary is that while audit trails certainly solve legal deadlocks, true prevention requires a proactive psychosocial hazard approach. We must respect the lived experience rather than just formalizing it into an immutable digital ledger.
I hear you.
Over-automating human relationships creates a dehumanizing compliance theater where the organization's primary goal is protecting itself from 25% uplifts rather than protecting the psychological safety of its workforce.
Well, we definitely have significant areas of convergence. We both fully agree that the Equality Act's blind spots and the absolute uselessness of constructive dismissal leave vulnerable employees completely exposed.
We do. And we both agree that shadow practices, specifically that new manager reversal we discussed, cause devastating clinical harm to employees. The statutory vacuum is a profound failure of the state.
But we remain fundamentally split on the solution. You believe that maintaining empathy and adopting a proactive hazard model must sit alongside structured pathways, or else we lose the human being entirely. I believe the ultimate answer is engineering out human discretion entirely to achieve perfect reconstructability.
Designing workplaces that are simultaneously audit-ready and genuinely human-centered is an incredibly profound complexity.
It is, and as the 2026 FWA enforcement frontier approaches, the intersection of neuroscience, law, and digital governance holds much more to be explored in the source material. There are massive questions ahead about vicarious liability, public sector accountability, and how we measure harm.
Listeners will have to decide for themselves which path will truly end workplace harm.
Let's think back to where we started. The expectation of precision, the exposed wire in the hallway. As we navigate the murky waters of workplace bullying in a legal vacuum, we have to ask ourselves, are we building machines that finally bring the invisible injuries into sharp focus? Or, as you said earlier, are we just designing better black boxes that tell us why the plane crashed instead of fixing the plane itself?